Good evening all, and welcome. Do you believe in witches, witchcraft, their power to summon things from dark places? Well, maybe you do, maybe you don't. But the people who have experienced these stories certainly did after what they encountered. So for now, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. I live in Eastern Europe, more exactly in Romania. You may have heard about those gypsy witches that live in my country. Most of them are just pretending to be something they're not. This, however, is the story of a real witch. My grandmother used to live in the same village with a witch. I don't know if the witch was a gypsy or Romanian, but it doesn't really matter. She lived for so many years that no one knew her age. This woman claimed to be a witch, and she had also claimed that she had this demon who served her. She used to talk about the ways she sold her soul one night in the forest while performing a ritual. In return, she gained powers and the help of a demon. She said that she couldn't die until she convinced someone to take full charge and responsibility of her duty as a witch and sell his or her soul to the darkness as well. She, I believe, had 3 daughters, but people said that their mother's behavior scared them away. They moved to Bucharest and never returned to the village. Now, you will say that she was most likely a crazy old woman, but no. A lot of people heard weird noises coming from her attic, and she agreed that the sounds were made by her slave demon. People, even though afraid, asked her to solve their problems and gave her money for doing so. No one ever complained about her work. No one. Everything was put in place no matter how difficult the task was. People witnessed a lot of hard work getting done overnight in her yard and garden. Things that she wasn't able to do alone. My grandmother met a woman on her way to work. The woman asked my grandmother about the witch. She wanted to know where the witch lived. My grandma gave indications and then asked her why she was going to go see her. She said that a thief broke into her house and stole her savings, and she wanted her money back. The next day, my grandmother met the woman again. She carried a bag, and my grandma asked her what happened. She said that she went to the witch and received the promise that she would be able to find the money on the table when she returned home. The witch asked in advance for half the money. The woman agreed. It was better than nothing, and things happened exactly as the witch foretold, and she carried the promised money in the bag on the way to the witch's house. Another story is that a woman fell in love with a married man. She went to the witch and told her that she wanted that man. The witch asked her if she wanted the man no matter what the consequences were. She said yes, and in less than a month, his wife got ill and passed. He remarried, and he got married to the woman who asked for his wife to fall. That's why she was seen as a powerful and real witch. For sure, she had some supernatural powers. Unfortunately, I don't know if she's still alive. I lived in the RGV, living in Edinburgh, but grew up in Rio Grande City my entire life. My grandma told me stories of her encounters with the lechuza when I was a kid. I was usually skeptical of mystical tales, but when it came to my grandmother, I bought her stories. It wasn't until I had my own experience that I was fully invested in other old wives' tales and folklore. I was out at a friend's ranch north of Rio Grande City with my buddy and a cousin of mine, a mutual friend and my buddy's dad. We were putting up some fence posts and barbed wire so we can corral some stray cattle that had wandered onto the property and keep them there until we found the owner. The sun was setting, so we decided to call it a day. We built a bonfire close by and huddled up in an unfinished ranch hand's house, basically a concrete slab surrounded by 4 walls and no roof. We were drinking and just shooting the breeze and telling stories from high school, when eventually we got to stories of the paranormal. My buddy is a huge skeptic, mostly because he's afraid of it. So he kept trying to steer the conversation away from ghosts and such. I decided to share a lechuza story my grandmother told me. Once I got to describing the creature, we heard an ungodly screech, almost ear-piercing. We all turned to look in the direction of the screech, and before my eyes can adjust to the darkness, I hear my buddy screaming that it's a lechuza, and he hauls ass to the main ranch house a few hundred yards away. I turn back to the darkness and see a giant silhouette of an owl perched on one of the posts we had driven earlier in the day. It was massive, so naturally I did one of the 2 things they tell you never to do. I whistled at it. This thing screeched again and spread out its wings. Its wingspan had to be in at least 7 feet in each direction, so 14 feet. The fence posts were spaced about 16 feet apart, and its wings almost spanned half the distance. Scared out of my mind, I pumped my chubby, tree-trunk thighs as hard as I could and ran. As I had the back door to the ranch house in view, I got to see my buddy run in and close the door behind him. My cousin and our friend got there moments later too, and I hadn't noticed they took off right after my buddy, and were kicking and pounding on the door nearly in tears. I get about halfway there and look back to the unfinished house and see the gigantic bird perched up on one of the walls, its face catching the moonlight as it cocks its head sideways, kind of how a dog does when they hear the owner make a strange sound. In the mere moment of its face being lit up, I swear I was able to make out human-like features with a bonfire lighting up the area behind it. I finally reach the ranch house and my buddy's dad opens the door and we're almost in tears. I rush in, close the door behind me, and my buddy's dad demands to know what's going on. Trying to catch my breath, I tell him with the others adding their points of view as well. We all look out the back door to see if it's still there, and just try to convince ourselves that we saw a regular owl, and my buddy's dad called us some rude names between chuckles. We scanned the horizon, and I'm armed with a baseball bat I found at the back door, my buddy with his firearm, and there's no bird. We got back with flashlights, me, my bat, my cousin, and a few weapons. We got back with our equipment, and our friend stayed back at the ranch house. He was done for the night. We get back to the bonfire to snuff it out. Smokey the Bear was always kind of an influence on me, and we investigate the surrounding area. My buddy's dad breaks off from the group to check out the fence posts to make sure they're undisturbed, while we just hang back to think what happened. After a bit, we go join my buddy's dad and find him standing in front of the post we had originally seen the lechuza perched on. We never told him which one specifically, so I was kind of surprised to see him at the one. And then we saw the claw marks. This happened to my uncle's wife. I will narrate it how she did to me and my sisters. We're from the northern state of Mexico, Nuevo León, from a small town south of Monterrey around El Cerro de la Silla. If you've never heard of it, do Google it, it's beautiful. Stories about people seeing witches and lechuzas around the town are very common, but my aunt's story really pulls a chill down my spine. The story goes like this. I lived in a small home up in the hills. I shared a room with my sister, our windows facing the main street. It was big, and it had rails on the window. One night, me and my sister were in bed. She was asleep, and I was awake, lying on my bed looking outside my window, since my bed was against the wall and right underneath the window. I liked opening the window and looking up at the sky. I remembered being around 3 a.m. when I decided that I had to get some rest. I stood up just to close my window, And that's when I saw her, the witch, flying right in front of my house. She saw me and we made eye contact, and I immediately shut my window and got under my covers and started praying. I eventually fell asleep and awoke to the fresh air hitting my face as I opened my eyes, and I see my head sticking out the window. I screamed as loud as I could, and my sister woke up to help me. I'd never been afraid like I had been at that moment in all my life, as I realized that it was only her power that caused me to look out my window like that. If it wasn't for the rails, she would have had me. My aunt told us that her grandma would tell that the witches would take kids out their windows at night, and she never believed her until it happened to her. She believed the witch wanted revenge because my aunt made eye contact with her. The crazy part is that until this day, she sometimes wakes up with random bruises or hickey marks on her skin. Well, that's her story. Norwich is an old medieval city in England and has lots of beautiful and interesting old places to visit. One of its most famous buildings is the towering Norwich Cathedral, opposite Tomland, which sits down by the river Wensum. Anyhow, busy exploring my new city one Saturday, I visited the cathedral, and after wandering the building, decided to explore the cathedral close. It was late, a sunny afternoon in October, with lots of autumn leaves on the ground, and I was really enjoying my walk when I stumbled upon a cobbled alley at the end of some houses, and decided to see where it led. The floor and walls were cobbled, and the walls maybe 10 feet high, so I couldn't see over them, but I could hear people in the gardens on the other side talking and children playing. Although I was on my own in the alleyway, I didn't feel alone. But as I began to walk on, the alley began to twist and turn, and although the sky was blue overhead and the sun was still out, I began to feel increasingly uneasy. I could no longer hear voices coming from the other side of the walls, and when I thought about it, realized that in fact I couldn't hear anything. No birds, no traffic, not even wind, and yet the cathedral is in the middle of a reasonably sized city. I began to feel nervous, and my scalp started to prick, and so I began to up my pace, telling myself that I'd been walking a while, and that the alleyway couldn't go on forever. But as I turned each blind bend, hoping to see the end of what was beginning to feel like a maze, I was only met with another stretch of alleyway. I began to jog, and although I hadn't seen anyone since entering the alleyway, and couldn't hear any footsteps on the cobbles behind me, I had the growing sensation that someone or something bad was following me close behind, and that the walls were pressing on. I started having difficulty breathing and realized I was also beginning to feel dizzy. I didn't want to pass out alone in this alleyway, and so decided to run. After what seemed like forever, I turned another corner and suddenly sprinted out onto a perfectly normal-looking street down by the river, and the city sounds returned. I realized I was shaking, my hand and forehead dripping with sweat, and didn't have a clue where I was. I sat down on a wall and had a cigarette and pulled myself together, and then stopped to pass by and asked for directions back to the market square in the middle of town, from where I could find my own way back to campus. It didn't take long to walk back to the market square, but when I checked my watch, it turned out that I had been in the alleyway for nearly an hour. It didn't make any sense, as I couldn't have walked that far, but I didn't want to know too much about it, and told myself that maybe it was all the twists and turns the alley had, and that added to the time. At class on Monday, I was telling a few people about the alleyway in the cathedral grounds, and how it had suddenly turned really spooky, when one of the mature students on our course, who had lived in Norwich for years and knew a lot about its history, overheard me. She asked me if the alley was an old cobbled one with high walls that led off the cathedral close, and I said yes. She took me aside and quietly explained to me that she wasn't surprised I'd felt what I did, because that was the alleyway they dragged people accused of witchcraft along before burning them at the stake, as Norwich has a huge history of witches. But the kicker to this story is that though I lived in Norwich for a number of years and often visited the cathedral, I never walked that alleyway again because of what happened, until that afternoon one day, when a friend from overseas was visiting. I took her down to the cathedral, and while there told her about the alleyway and what I'd experienced. She insisted that we walk it, and when I stalled and started to make excuses, promised me that if things started to go bad, we would just turn back and she would stay with me at all times. Reluctantly, I agreed. The alley was just how I remembered it at first, dry cobbled floor and high cobbled walls backing onto people's gardens. But after 10 minutes at most, and only a handful of turns, suddenly we found ourselves back onto the street. It didn't make any sense to me back then, and it still doesn't to this day, and I don't go near the Witch's Walk anymore. This happened in Manitou Springs. My wife and I at the time had a long commute between work and our home. We drove to the city in the daytime, came to our apartment in the evening. We had our youngest daughter at the time and were unloading some groceries. My wife saw from the corner of her eye a figure approaching. It was bizarre for her to get defensive, since many tourists walked the roads we lived on, Rutan Avenue. She took our daughter inside right away, fearing something amiss. She came back out to help me and told me she felt weak all of a sudden and started pointing at this lady walking up the hill. She noticed the person did not look like someone she wanted to be in the presence of and fled inside immediately after seeing what they looked like. I, however, stayed, not knowing what I could make eye contact with. She looked homeless, which was common as a lot of people come to Colorado for the pot craze. This was different. She had a burlapped sack cut in sections that almost had a weird aura, almost a memorization of confusion. Her face was scarred and deformed. She looked like she had a humpback, but possibly could have been carrying supplies. I made eye contact for the briefest moment, almost feeling an energy pushing me away. She had a staff too, and was walking very slow. I got chills, turned to grab the last of the bags, and as soon as I did, she was gone. I knew she would be there, and my curiosity struck me to see what this entity was. But she vanished, poofed into nowhere, one-way street with a river next to the road. I later went out to enjoy a cigarette that very night. It was 2 or 3 in the morning, very late, super dark, and no lights on the street. It was a hill, so I looked up the road and noticed up in the pass in the faint distance I could see colors changing, almost like a flame burning. But not the same colors. It was more purple, blue, and black. I still do not know to this day what this thing was. If it was a trick, it was well played. But the street had a very dark history. No doubt in my mind, this thing could have been a witch or demon of some sort. Yesterday, I walked into a witch store with my friend. She was genuinely curious and practiced witchcraft. I didn't mind at all. I found it interesting, to say the least. As she was looking for candles, I was exploring the store. The walls were painted black, with only lights dimly lit in the store. There was a section in the back where dead animals were encased in glass jars being sold. It sent chills up my spine and gave me goosebumps. About 5 minutes later, I noticed that my body felt cold. It was a warm, sunny day in the city. Why was I freezing? And then, it felt as if something slipped into my body. It was subtle, and after a few thoughts of wondering and confusion, I forgot all about it. A few hours later at home, I felt pretty tired. It was probably just exhaustion because it was a fun day walking around the city. However, I for some reason wanted to sleep early. It was 6 p.m. I could tell something was off, but I pushed it aside and tried to get back to sleep. I somehow couldn't. I kept tossing and turning. Suddenly I was starving. I got out of bed and asked my mum if there was anything to eat. I ate, but couldn't chew normally. Everything seemed out of place. When I walked around, everything was in slow motion. I felt dizzy and fell to my knees. I quickly picked myself up and rushed back into bed. A few minutes later, I got up again, but this time the feeling I had was like the urge to vomit, but nothing came out. After many attempts, I had pain in my lower abdomen. It didn't feel like period cramps. It was so painful that I passed out. The next thing I knew, I awoke to see a needle in my arm connected to a tube leading to an IV. I was in the hospital. The doctor said I was fine, nothing was wrong with my body. I also do feel fine. Right now, I'm currently sharing this and don't feel different or sick. Was there an evil spirit in that witch store that entered my body? If there was, I hope it doesn't choose to return. Recently, I had a terrible nightmare triggered by the ghost at my job, and it took me back to an event that happened in Snyder County, Pennsylvania, back between 2010 and 2015. I was between the ages of 13 to 18. Those 5 years were an absolute hell and tore my family apart. Many things happened at this house, ranging from violent enough to push my dad down the stairs to simple cold spots. However, the story I'm going to share is the night that stuck with me the most. In 2008, when the market crashed and people started losing their houses, my family was a part of it. I watched my parents struggle for a long time before finally giving up and moving closer to my school district, where we started renting the right side of a duplex. To give a bit of an image of the house, it consisted of 3 stories above the ground and a basement. The first floor had a closed-off porch, a large divided living room, a very small kitchen, and a small closed-off back porch. At the kitchen entrance was the food closet, and directly across from that was the door to the basement. Upstairs were 3 bedrooms and a full bathroom. Every room upstairs had a carpet in it, except for my parents' bedroom at the end of the hall. Yes, even the bathroom was carpeted. Through the room closet to the bathroom, my brother's room, was the door to the attic. The attic was a large room that we never used, and because it would open on its own accord, my brother pushed his dresser in front of it. At the other half of the house was an elderly lady and her daughter. The two fought almost every night, and after they moved out, they hired a man to fix up their side and sell it. Well, he invited my parents and I over one day to tell us what he had planned to work on. So he was really letting us know that it was going to be noisy for a while. He showed us a room in the basement that was painted all black with colors painted throughout it, as well as candles and a Ouija board at the center. He had thrown that stuff out before we could even see it though. Now that you have the layout of the house, let me begin the event that haunts me to this day. It was a clear night on Wednesday, about 7 or 8 p.m. My parents were a part of pool league, so they were out that night. My brother was basically living with my cousin at the time too, so I was completely home alone with 3 dogs and what I strongly believe was a demon. I was sitting in my father's favorite chair. The chair faced the kitchen, and I was a typical teenager texting on my phone and watching TV when I heard what sounded like the dogs getting into the garbage out in the darker than usual kitchen. This was pretty common since our boxer Max liked to pull empty bottles from the trash if we didn't give them to him. He likes to take the lids off. He'd give the caps to our 2 chihuahuas to play with while he played with the bottle. I yelled for the dogs to get back into the living room and out of the trash. It didn't stop the sound of rustling trash bags, so I was about to get up and go out there. But I looked down and see Max laying in front of the TV, while Scrappy and Cocoa, the chihuahuas, were curled on my mum's chair that faced the stairs. Sure, this spooked me a little, but I was used to this kind of thing. It became common for things to be the ghost if it wasn't the dogs. I did my best to ignore the sound and continued watching TV. However, my attention was snapped away when the light in that half of the divided living room started to dim and brighten repeatedly and fast. The feeling of being watched heightened around this time too. But again, the being watched feeling was something I had gotten used to. I began texting my mum, asking how much longer they were going to be out. She told me it wouldn't be too much longer, but I knew it wouldn't be until way later in the night. I continued to do my best to ignore it, but then it started to sound like someone was walking around upstairs in my room and in the hallway. I was not about to go investigate on my own. As a huge fan of horror, I knew that this would be unwise. Once again, I texted my mum and this time told her that the ghost was acting up and that I was getting scared. Deciding that it was getting to be too much for me, I moved to the other half of the living room where the couch was to try and get away from whatever it was. I used to sleep on the couch, so it was already set up for me to hide under the covers. I called all 3 dogs with me as well as an attempt to keep us all safe. I really wish I could say that that was where the event ended and that my parents came home right then and there. Above the half of the living room I had moved into was my parents' bedroom. In their bedroom was a very heavy solid oak dresser and a just as heavy metal framed bed. I could hear what sounded like someone pushing around the dresser and bed. It sounded like someone was rearranging my parents' bedroom. At this point I could no longer ignore everything that was happening in the house. It honestly was as if the house was coming to life. And it was at that point I called my mum, demanding she come home because something was very wrong and there was nothing I could do to make any of it stop. I think the whole "it sounds like someone is rearranging your bedroom" thing made her think someone might have broken in. But there's no way someone could have broken in and got up the stairs without me seeing them. Even if they did find a way onto the roof and into the house, I don't think they'd be quiet enough to make it undetected with 3 dogs. Either way, I had no other option than to try and hide and ignore it all. What felt like an eternity passed before my parents got home, and by the time they did, everything had stopped. Once in the door, my dad went upstairs with my mum and I closed behind. We checked every room on the 2nd floor, only to find no one there, and nothing had been changed or moved. Well, that was scary, but the events didn't stop there. The spectre wouldn't stop touching my mum's face one night. She said it felt like spider webs all over her and she couldn't get them off. My brother and mum were home one day, and my brother said, "There's nothing actually here, right?" To which the thing responded by opening a kitchen cupboard and then closing it. Another night, my mum had woken up from sleeping on her chair that faced the stairs. She thought Coco was coming down the stairs, so she called for him to come and join her, but the dog was already on her lap. When she looked up, the shadow coming down the stairs was gone. Every morning at 2:30 a.m., the bathroom door upstairs would open or close. This is still unexplained because it was over carpet and it took a lot of force to open or close. My grandmother had given me a doll that would rock in a circle and play music, but you had to wind it up first. One day I was just chilling in my room minding my own business, and it started playing on its own. The attic window would open on its own too, and we never used the attic. We never used it to the point my brother pushed his dresser in front of the door like I said before. He did it to make sure the door would stop rattling. I was relaxing in the living room one night, and the mudroom door was swaying, and me being an annoying teen shouted, "Could you please stop with the door?" And it stopped. My mum also demanded it leave us and the dogs alone, and she heard a very clear, loud single knock upstairs. Things were quiet for a while, until the other side of the house was getting renovated, and then it came back worse than before. My dad was coming down the stairs one day, and it looked like he got pushed. He tried to catch himself, but he slid down the stairs and sliced his foot open on the radiator at the bottom. I mean, it could have been worse, I guess. One time in the middle of the day, I was just relaxing on the couch when my sleeping dog was thrown off the chair across the room with so much force he was spun around facing the chair just as he was sleeping on. He landed on the floor right in front of the couch. The chair was rocking so fast and hard I'm surprised it didn't flip. The poor dog was so scared he hid behind the toilet on the back porch. We took him out the house for a few hours, and when he got home he hid again. My dog also used to stare and follow things that were not there. Things would go missing too. Shortly after moving in, I would hear a voice saying my name quietly and a lot, usually in the kitchen, almost as if it were a whisper. The first week after we moved in, we heard what sounded like glass breaking, but it sounded like it was outside, so we called the cops and they looked around to find nothing. I later went to use the bathroom and found the glass around the light bulb had shattered in the sink. Not a shard of glass anywhere else. This is impossible, because there were 4 lights above the sink, stretching far enough across that the first and last bulb were not over the sink at all. The last bulb should have hit the toilet if it fell, but like I said, it was the only glass around the bulb. The metal was still intact and turned on. This was the first sign of there being something wrong. My whole family fell into a depression while living there, and we were constantly fighting with each other. It was never like this before we moved into that house. Sure, we all had our problems, but it was like that house escalated very negative energy. My dad tried to end his own life while living there. I tried to do the same, and my brother straight up left. And I know my mum was giving up too, because she just wanted to leave everything and go. I strongly believe that house, or whatever entity our neighbors summoned, that witch, tore my family apart. This happened when I was about 4 or 5. Among my siblings and cousins, we always said that my grandma's house was haunted. You could hear footsteps and whispers at night, and the back room would always be colder and would get a heavy, oppressive feeling. So one day, all of the older kids went to hang out, and my parents took my grandma to run errands, so it was only me and my aunt and uncle at home. They were cleaning the backyard, and I was playing with toys in the dirt. For whichever reason, I can't remember, I went inside and went into the back room, which was my grandma's at the time. As I stood there, I remember that heavy feeling starting to creep in. There was a big window that I looked out into the backyard, and I decided to go to it. As I moved the curtain, I could see this really old trailer that sat in the backyard that was used for storage. The doorway would have only been about 5 feet from the window. As I looked out, I immediately noticed a figure in the doorway of the trailer. It filled most of the doorway. It was dressed in a long black dress with like a turtleneck. The dress being super black. I don't think I've ever seen such a pure black in my life. It had a bald, round, wrinkly head with tall, pointy ears. Think of the goblins from Harry Potter. And the hands ended in long, sharp talons. All the skin of this thing was really sickly, this shade of green, and it just stood in the trailer staring back at me. Then it began to shake its head and index finger as if to say, no, like you'd tell a little kid. After that, it slid out of view and the heavy feeling lifted. I don't recall what I did after that, but I don't remember feeling scared. More confused, I would say. I had forgotten about the event until years and years passed, when the siblings were sitting around reminiscing after my grandma passed, and my sister said she remembered seeing something similar. She said she also saw a woman in a long red dress and a pumpkin for a head, sitting by the water fountain or bird bath. The house isn't in the family anymore, so I can't say that something else happened, but we all suspect that there was a witch residing in or around Grandma's house. My great-grandmother Emily owned a house on Glenwood Avenue in Owasso. She was fairly well off, So she let my mum's mother move into her house when she was falling on hard times with her husband and their kids, and my great-grandmother Emily moved out. I'm going to try to make this as easy to understand as possible to who is who, so I'm going to lay out who moved into the house first. My grandma Pat, who is my mother's mother, has 3 kids: Charlotte, my mother, Chris, and James. She was married to a man called Butch, who also had 3 kids: Sandy, Lee, and Greg. These are all events that my mum and Grandma Pat both separately told me throughout my life. I'm 22 now and have told my friends about them through the years. I've been hearing these stories for a while and think it's time to share these experiences. I want to give a bit of information about my great-grandma Emily when she lived there. She told my grandma that some strange things had been happening in the house when she was in bed. It felt like a cat walked over her and she had no animals. She told my grandma that something would tug her blanket at the end of her bed when she would have to clutch onto it to keep it there or it would be pulled off. Water would also run in the bathroom constantly and she would have to get up and turn it off throughout the night. My mum moved into the house and she made some friends around the neighborhood. They would tease her about how a witch lived there before and did witchcraft in the basement and said the house was haunted. My mum brushed it off, thinking they were trying to scare her. My mum said that her and her stepsister Sandy shared a room, and she said that red glowing eyes would look at them in the closet. My mum said they would be so scared that they would sleep in the same bed, and Sandy even ran and flicked on the light and moved the toys around in the closet, thinking it was just a light. But as soon as the light would flick back off and Sandy got back into bed with my mum, they would reappear. My mum told me that they would pull long black hairs from the drywall leading to the staircase, and that the drywall would literally just crumble. She also told me that one night my grandma Pat was waiting for her husband Butch to get home. She was watching TV in the living room and she was laying on a pull-out bed. She sat up to get a drink of water and had her feet on the floor, and something grabbed her ankle and squeezed. It shook her so hard from underneath the bed that it left a bruise. She looked under the bed thinking it was one of the kids, and she saw nothing was there, so she yelled for my mum to come out with her until her husband got home. She told my mum what happened, and they were both terrified. I asked my grandma about this, and she told me the exact same thing. My grandma also told me that she'd seen large black figures in the home multiple times. I just got off the phone with my grandma to try and get everything as accurate as possible. She didn't have much time because she was at work, but she did tell me that a man hung himself in the basement and that she would see things in the kitchen a lot, like large black figures. The basement door was in the kitchen. She said that my mum would too, to the point that she would scream and cry multiple times from the ages of 2.5, and told me that they moved out once when my mum was younger because of the weird stuff that was going on, and someone else moved in for a while, but they had to move back several years later, which was when she was grabbed from under the bed. She said something grabbed her by the ankle and shook the hell out of it. My great-grandmother Emily owned the house the entire time, which is why they ended up back there. She also said that her son James had seen the red glowing eyes, and all of the other kids would hear and see things constantly. But after things got physical with her, and it grabbed her ankle, she got out of there for her own good. She also said that renters wouldn't stop moving out of the house very quickly, until someone purchased it years later and it had been blessed. She thinks they're still living there to this day. When I was around 15, my mum told me about this again because it was so scary and interesting to me. I would have my mum retell me everything that happened in the house all the time, and I ended up finding the house online while I was searching through articles to see if any information was available about it. I found that right down the street was Rosevere Park and Woods, and is said to be one of the most haunted places in Owasso. I'm not sure if it has any correlation with the house, but I just thought it was strange. This takes place in La Pateca, which is a rural area just south of Monterrey in Mexico. When I was a little girl, we always had legends of the witches in the wild. Don't go out alone, don't stay out so late at night. If you do, the witches will come and take you away, my mama would tell me and my brother Armando every day. Mama would not let me or Armando go anywhere unless it was both of us, and the furthest we could go was the little store a mile away when we needed groceries. We were not well off with money, so we had to walk everywhere. When Armando and I got done working the fields, Mama would let us play until it was night time. Sometimes we would play tag with our friends, sometimes Papa would chase us around or take us exploring in the woods. The exploring was fun, because we got to see animals, but we also saw the little old huts where the witches lived. Everyone called them the witches, because they were weird and would constantly do black magic and talk to themselves. One day Armando and I were playing alone, because Papa was tired from working on the field all day and Mama was making supper. We went to the woods and started to explore, but we went too deep and got lost. I cried and cried because I wanted Mama, but nobody heard us, so we kept walking around. After a little bit, an old lady heard us and said she would help us. "No, you're a witch and you're gonna take us away," yelled Armando. "No, mijo. I know where your mommy and papi are," she said. I cried and told Armando that I wanted to go home. So he gave up and told the lady to help us. "Okay, follow me." After a while, she took us to a house we didn't know, but said Mama and Papa were inside, so we went. Without thinking, we went in, and the lady suddenly grabs us and starts carrying us, screaming, into another room. She threw us in and locked the door. Armando kept banging on it and yelling to let us go, and I just cried and cried. It was quite quiet, but I thought I kept heard her saying, "Glory to God. He has given me pure blood of the innocent. With this, I'm gonna seek my revenge against those who have done things to me in the past." I don't exactly remember how much time passed, because I was tired after crying for so long. According to Papa, we were not home, so he went around town looking for us until he came into the woods to look. He said he stopped at the house where we were at because something made him look there. When Papa called out to the house inside, the witch kept yelling at him to go away, but he said he thought he heard Armando, so he broke in to look around. He found us and said he heard banging, which showed him where we were. When he found us, he hugged us and took us away, telling her that if he ever saw her near the house again or the kids, he would end her. Mama was crying so hard when we saw her that it made me cry again. Papa yelled at us for being dumb and going out so far, and Armando just looked at the floor. After that, Mama didn't let us go out anymore without her or Papa until we were teenagers. Every day I thank God for not letting me and Armando get into more danger that day. I do not know what the witch wanted to do to us, but I don't think I want to know either. Hey guys, it's Mort here and thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed the witch stories tonight. It was a request by one of the mods and Patreons I have called Pastel Witch over on our Discord server. If you're interested in chatting and chilling in Discord, the link is in the description. It's a quiet place, but you know, I'm sometimes there if you want to stick around and chat and stuff. Anyway, if you enjoyed tonight's video, please don't forget to let me know, and as always, a huge thank you to my wonderful patrons, as always. If you'd like your name on screen, feel free to check out the link in the description, as it will take you to my Patreon page. And for a small amount of money, you can sign up and contribute a little bit every month to help keep the channel going. And it helps me immensely. So consider it. Thanks, guys. But anyway, For now, guys, it's time for me to sign off. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.